Good morning, good afternoon for those joining us from Africa. I hope that you're all keeping well. My name is Andrew Kanyegire. I'm with the communications team here at the IMF. Thank you for joining us for this virtual October 2021 annual meetings press conference on the regional economic outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa. I am here with Mr. Abebe, Aemro Selassie, the Director of the African Department here at the IMF. Abebe will give brief opening remarks, after which we shall turn to your questions. And thanks to those that have already sent in questions. We shall also be checking on WebEx and also via our press center. You can also view and listen in via our various social media sites. That's YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and our website as well. The report, the press release, Abe's opening remarks are all available under embargo, and they should also be on our website as of now. Abe, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, good afternoon from my end also. And thank you for joining us for the release of the October Regional Economic Outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa. The pandemic has shown us the deeply interconnected nature of our planet. Global challenges such as ending the current pandemic or addressing climate change require global solutions. The path to addressing both these major challenges on a global scale runs directly through Sub-Saharan Africa. Before taking your questions, I would like to draw on our latest assessment of the economic outlook, challenges, and immediate policy priorities. But before delving into that, I would like to first take a moment to reflect on how the region is contending with the ongoing pandemic. The global health crisis has revealed two very different realities. What has emerged is two worlds, one mainly in the most advanced economies where recovery continues apace, fueled by plentiful vaccine supply. The other in vulnerable emerging and developing economies where differences in policy space and a slower vaccine rollout is slowing progress. Since April, when we last updated our regional economic outlook, Sub-Saharan Africa has been hit by a third wave of the pandemic, this time with the more contagious Delta variant, with infection rates often rising to triple, quadruple the rates that were seen in earlier waves. Thankfully, this wave has now eased over the past month or so, but there is little reason to believe that there won't be repeated waves going forward. This is also because vaccination efforts in Sub-Saharan Africa have been slower than other regions, due mostly to stockpiling by advanced countries, export restrictions by major vaccine manufacturing countries, and additional demands for booster shots that we're seeing in advanced economies that could further compromise supply. At the moment, only around 3% of the population in Sub-Saharan Africa has been fully vaccinated, in sharp contrast to most advanced economies that are close to the 60% or more level of vaccination. Lockdowns have been the main option for containing the virus when there have been outbreaks in the absence of vaccinations. And although recent lockdowns have been less severe than those in early stages of the pandemic, their cumulative impact on economic activity and confidence has remained significant. Now, turning to the economic outlook for the region, we estimate that Sub-Saharan Africa's economy will grow by 3.7% this year and 3.8% in 2022. The recovery is being supported by favorable external conditions on trade and commodity prices. It has also benefited from improved harvests and increased agricultural production in a number of countries. And the recovery, of course, follows the sharp contraction in 2020 and is, of course, very much welcome. Still, it represents the slowest growth relative to most other regions of the world. For example, advanced economies are projected to return to their pre-crisis paths of economic activity by 2023. The pandemic, however, looks to have durably lowered the path for real GDP in Sub-Saharan Africa, suggesting a loss of real per capita income of close to 5.5% relative to the pre-crisis path. This divergence reflects Sub-Saharan Africa's two factors. First, the slow vaccine rollout, and second, stark differences in policy space. Against this backdrop, I want to highlight 3 areas where concerted action is needed by policymakers in countries and indeed the international community. The first of these is inequality. The pandemic has thrown some 30 million people back into extreme poverty and has worsened inequality not only across income groups, but also across subnational and geographic regions within countries. Moreover, conditions are set to be exacerbated further, in many cases, by the pronounced rise in food and fuel prices that we are seeing now. Lower incomes and rising food prices are a recipe for further erosion of past gains in poverty reduction, health outcomes, and improved food security. Policies need to be squarely focused on addressing this challenge. Left unaddressed, it will be a further source of misery to people and indeed rising political and social insecurity. Second, policymakers in Sub-Saharan Africa need to navigate an increasingly difficult and complex policy environment. Against the backdrop of a context of weaker than expected growth, policymakers need to navigate among 3 formidable pressures. Pressing spending needs to address the many social and human capital and infrastructure needs they face. Limited borrowing capacity, given the already high public debt levels in most cases. And the time-consuming and politically difficult nature of mobilizing tax revenues. How deftly countries navigate this trilemma, as we've been calling it, will have a huge bearing on macroeconomic well-being of countries, as well as economic growth prospects. The third challenge is the divergent health, poverty, and economic outcomes that we are seeing, pointing to the critical importance of international solidarity and support. On COVID-19, the threat of new variants highlights the need for a global response with a particular focus on the vaccinated people of Africa. The IMF has proposed a plan to vaccinate at least 40% of the total population of all countries by the end of 2021 and 70% by the first half of 2022. For Sub-Saharan Africa, these goals are ambitious and will require a marked change in strategy by both advanced economies and Sub-Saharan African countries. More broadly, significant external concessional financing is needed to limit and eventually close the divergent recovery paths of Sub-Saharan Africa and the rest of the world. Without this financing, the divergent recovery paths could harden into permanent fault lines, jeopardizing decades of hard-won progress. International organizations and donors have mobilized swiftly to support the region over the last year, but much more multilateral action still is critical considering the region's elevated financing needs. Action is also needed to ensure that available mechanisms for debt restructurings are nimble and effective to avoid the burden of adjustment falling on the poor and to facilitate quicker economic recovery. For our part, the IMF, more than ever, remains committed to supporting Sub-Saharan Africa tackle the broad array of challenges it faces. The most recent way in which we have done so is the recent general SDR allocation, which has boosted the region's reserves, easing some of the burden on authorities as they guide their country's recovery. And much work is also underway to rechannel SDRs from countries with strong external positions to countries with weaker fundamentals to further bolster the region's resilience. In our view, Sub-Saharan Africa's vast potential remains undiminished. Over the next 3 decades, the global population is set to grow by about 2 billion people, with about half of that increase coming from Sub-Saharan Africa. This presents a huge opportunity, a growing pool of human talent and ingenuity that will have a telling effect on the economic, social, and political trajectory of our planet. We need to pay more attention to this phenomenal opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Abe, for those opening remarks. We shall now turn to question time. please turn on your camera if you're in WebEx and you have a question, and we shall take it via that. And also request that you name your organization and try to make the questions clear and to the point. I think we'll start with Julian's Mboko from NTV in Kenya.
Thank you very much. My name, as mentioned, is Julian Samboko from NTV in Nairobi, Kenya. Quick question to Abebe. The last conversation we had earlier this year, you did speak at length about the trilemma and the policy complexities that countries were grappling with. In your assessment, how is the state of play 6 or so months down the line? Are we navigating it in the path that you would think is ideal, or how do you assess how the situation is evolving across the region?
Thank you, Julian. So I think, of course, as always, it's important to not overly generalize, and country circumstances differ across the region. But I would say we are about the same where we were in April, and indeed in some countries the situation a bit more difficult, given that we hadn't fully expected a third wave, of course, earlier in the year. So that has complicated matters, slowed economic activity in a number of countries. So the pressure, the need for pursuing the reforms that we've talked about in the past is very much alive in the vast majority of countries. Now, what are these reforms? They're very country specific, of course, but I would argue fall into 2-3 broad areas. I think the first one is, even before the pandemic, we saw a pressing need for countries to mobilize more revenues, instead of using debt financing, using tax revenues to address the many spending pressures that countries face. I think that need is very much even more pressing now, given that debt levels have gone up and spending pressures are even higher than before the pandemic. So I think this is an area where quite a bit of attention is going to be needed. Now, what exact tax policy changes are going to be needed is country and context specific, and of course something that is requires deep domestic political internal discussions. So but I think having a clear roadmap on how revenues can be mobilized over the medium term is going to be really very important in an increasing number of countries. Second, prioritizing spending will also be very important. Some difficult trade-offs there. One thing that I would highlight is, inequality we've seen has been going up. Pressures are going to be more still in the coming months from higher food prices in some countries, higher fuel prices in other cases. And I think more of a focus on social protection, more of a focus on trying to make sure that there is not excessive scarring from kids having had their education interrupted, what we can do to spend more to make sure that they can recover the education gains. That kind of a focus is going to be very important. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Abe. So I think we'll turn to Mbo Nguni of Megi in Botswana. Mbo, are you there? If not, can we...
I'm there.
Oh, great.
Yeah, sorry.
Please, go ahead. We can hear you.
Okay, apologies for that. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you. Go ahead, Mbo.
Yes, good afternoon. My questions are around the forecast that has been made for Botswana. We noted that at 9.2% for 2021, the IMF believes that Botswana's growth will be the highest in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we just wanted, if you could possibly share your insights into how you came about with that figure. What do you think will be driving the growth, and where are you weighing the risks, upside or downside, for 2021? Thank you.
Thanks, Sambo. So, you know, Botswana, of course, was hit very, very hard by the pandemic last year. And there is an element of a bounce from that very significant contraction that the economy faced last year, which is leading to the very high number. As well, there are a number of one-off factors that will contribute to the very high growth that we're seeing. You know, so it is good, and it is something to be of course grateful for. But I think over the medium term we will see growth reverting back to the pre-crisis path, which is of course considerably lower than the 9% that will be registered this year. In terms of risks to the outlook, I think, you know, in Botswana's case, you know, a lot is going to depend on the reforms that are pursued by the government. Pre-crisis, an important policy agenda item was economic diversification, away from relying on diamonds to broadening the sources of economic activity that could bolster growth and revenues. I think that agenda is very much something that will need quite a bit of attention. Again, social protection and strengthening human capital is also going to be a very important part of the policy agenda. Subject to progress in these areas, I think, you know, there should be upside to the growth path that we're seeing in our projections.
Thank you, Abe. We're keeping track of all the questions that are coming in, both on WebEx and online. So let's go to Simon Ateba. Simon, are you there?
Okay.
Great.
Yeah, I am.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for taking my question. This is Simon Ateba with Today News Africa in Washington, D.C. And thank you for, you know, the briefing. It seems to me that the picture you are painting is actually a very bleak picture. On the one hand, you have Africa's economy growing far below the global average this year. And on the other hand, you have debt and you have financing $250 billion needed in the next 5 years. And this is happening at the same time the population is growing and the vaccination rate in Africa is really low. So I guess my question is, how do we navigate it? It seems to me that we need more than just all those normal reform. Maybe we need something like the Marshall Plan or something. How do we navigate all this, the debt, the vaccination, and you know, the bleak picture that you just painted? Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. So, you know, let's not forget, I mean, this is a completely exogenous shock and has of course, unsurprisingly impacted our people, our economies quite significantly. But I think it's really important to disentangle, you know, structural from more temporary factors as we look to thinking about a new development paradigm, a new development agenda for our region. I think, you know, there is no doubt. I mean, you mentioned a need for a Marshall Plan. I mean, there is no doubt that there is going to be need for significant external financing, but I would argue that, you know, that has to be accompanied by reforms, domestic reforms. On, you know, again, it's going to be country specific, but, you know, a broad way of capturing this would be, you know, in each country to try and identify those reforms that are needed to alleviate the constraints on growth, the constraints on investment by domestic investors in particular. Identifying and alleviating those will be very, very important. Second, I think, you know, the reforms in the fiscal policy space will be important. I mentioned earlier the need for tax mobilization, but on the spending side, you know, reprioritizing spending, making sure that the limited resources governments have go to projects of the highest rates of return is going to be imperative. Making sure that there's no leakage, you know, from government spending, also another very important reform agenda before the crisis. Even more important now. So addressing these will also be important. I'm emphasizing here reforms because I think there's a tendency to think that, our countries, that, our policymakers don't have agency, and a strong recovery is going to only be possible by external financing or, Marshall Plan, etc. I think we saw our countries enjoying a period of 15, 18 years of strong growth from 2000 till the pre-pandemic in many cases. There's no reason not to think that that period cannot be repeated, given all of the potential that countries have. So in sum, yes, the region is going through a difficult period. Yes, the crisis has exacted a heavy toll on our countries, but subject to reforms, I'm very certain that a strong recovery will be at hand.
Thank you, Abe. So I think we shall now turn to Mario Batista. Mario, are you there? Okay. If not, Mario, I might come back to you. Can we go to Bukola Idou? Bukola, are you there? Okay. Seem to be having some connectivity.
Yes, I am here.
Okay, please.
Morning.
Please go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. You in the report, in the outlook, you mentioned that Nigeria's remittance dropped by 28%, and you did mention that Africans' remittance is expected to increase. Do you also see Nigeria's remittance increasing, considering the policies that have been put in place in the country in recent times?
Thanks. I think on remittances, in terms of what explains why they have declined, I would argue two factors. I mean, one, of course, is the economic conditions, particularly last year and through the earlier part of this year, in many of the advanced countries, other countries where expatriate Nigerians are and send money back, have not been very good. So it's not surprising that remittances might have dropped. So that's one factor. But a second factor, I think, is the uncertainty in the foreign exchange market that has prevailed in Nigeria over the last year. I don't think that's been very conducive to remittances flowing as much as they were before, or indeed being captured by the official financial sector. So I think that has been a second factor. I think going forward, as long as the reforms in the foreign exchange market that are required to try and make sure that the country moves through having a single unified foreign exchange market can take place, will reduce uncertainty, and that will increase confidence and allow more remittances to flow and be captured by the financial sector. I think that's going to be a very important contributor. And so the extent to which remittances we see being recorded increase will depend partly on that also.
Thank you, Abe. Mario Batista of Lusa is having some connectivity issues, but I do have his question here, and I will read out for us. So what explains, after 3 years of a financial aid package with Angola, that the country has not been able to restart its economic growth? So that's sort of his top question. And then he has another one on Equatorial Guinea, which we can probably take as well now. And he's asking if you could provide an update on the recalibration of the EFF, the Extended Fund Facility Program, that was set up in December 2019, according to his memory. Anyway, so Angola and Equatorial Guinea's program and where it stands currently.
Okay, Thanks. So, on Angola, when the program started in, I think it was 2018, of course, nobody expected the pandemic and indeed, the awful consequences it would come to have. To my mind, I think, in terms of the reforms that the country needed to do, the country needs a lot of credit for having persisted with that, notwithstanding the incredibly difficult toll that the pandemic has exacted on Angola's people and indeed its economy, including, of course, the big slump in oil prices for much of the last year and a half. So I think, really credit to the country, because despite this monumental shock, they've persevered with the reforms and also, are now kind of coming out at the other side, having gone significant steps towards reducing macroeconomic imbalances and positioning the country to benefit from the global recovery in oil prices that we are seeing at the moment. Growth remains weak, indeed. This year, the third wave in Angola was particularly severe. Again, that wasn't something that we had anticipated in our projection, which is why we revised growth down. But I think subject to the pandemic waning and the global recovery that we're seeing persisting, we're very confident that Angola will be able to enjoy the fruits of all of the reforms that it has been doing over the last couple of years, including in improving transparency in public finance management, improving the condition of the financial sector, and many other such reforms. Turning to Equatorial Guinea, the extended fund facility, which was approved at the end of 2019, was, of course, implementation of the reforms envisaged there was very badly disrupted by the pandemic. Country has a fairly weak implementation capacity, and that was, basically compounded by the effects of the pandemic, making it difficult to, of course, bring in some of the capacity development, audit, and other exercises that were needed to continue to improve public finance management. More recently, of course, the country has also been hit beyond the pandemic by the awful explosion in Bata, which exacted, a huge toll on many lives in the country. We have provided support, some financial relief through emergency financing to tie things over. But right now we are in discussions to go back to the reform program by completing all of the structural benchmarks and conditions that are going to be needed to take the country forward. The government has remained very, very committed to these reforms, and we're hopeful that they can implement those so we can continue to support them.
Thank you, Abebe. So we'll go to Pierre with AFP, please. Pierre, are you there? If not, then can we turn to Claude in Benin, if your connection can get through? Okay, so I think, Abebe, I'll tweak slightly here. We do have a question from somebody else who's also tuning in, listening in, but they're not able to connect, and it's from Kemi Osukoya with Africa Bazaar magazine. It's a bit of a long question, but anyway, she's asking, in the latest report, you list 21 countries on the continent as being expected to grow by about 5%. And, the continent is on the spotlight again. There is renewed interest from the US and the EU and other advanced and emerging economies due to competition with China. And she's asking, what are some of the bold transformative actions that African policymakers can take to encourage growth in some of the other countries that are not growing as fast as the 21 that I've mentioned? And what should policymakers be doing to lock in the much needed sustainable economic growth across the continent?
Thanks. I think this is a good opportunity to discuss kind of, to bring focus to the many countries in the region that are indeed continuing to enjoy fairly robust growth. So, I think, there are many countries. I mean, we discussed a moment ago Botswana, but also countries like Rwanda, Cote d'Ivoire, that are enjoying growth not too far below the pre-crisis levels of growth. And again, this speaks to not just the potential of our countries, but also to the resilience that we often exhibit in the face of shocks. So, in those countries where growth has recovered back to close to or back to pre-crisis growth trajectories, and there's a good 40% or so of countries in the region, what is really important is to begin to move away from the very supportive monetary policy, fiscal policy stance that has been pursued over the last year to more sustainable policy positions over the medium term. That are consistent with medium-term macroeconomic stability, that's the sustainability. That will be really very important. Over the last year, a very supportive stance has been needed to make sure that there is a strong recovery, that there is enough support for our people. But now I think making sure that in a gradual way that support can be recalibrated will be very important. Second, I think, is continuing to, even when you're growing at 5-6%, continuing to make sure that you have upgrading of institutions, upgrading of industries is going to be really important to keep pace with the need to deal with all of the changes that are likely to take place post-pandemic, as countries are rethinking about supply chains, rethinking about what are going to be the main drivers of economic activity going forward. So I think continuing to think, reflect on that, and preparing country-specific plans, how to keep pace will be very important. I want to also say a little bit, though, about the countries that are not growing as fast. I think in the main, this tends to be the commodity exporting countries. What we're seeing there, of course, is the fact that they have a very narrow economic base. And last year, the decline in commodity prices was very, very severe and came on top of 3-4 years of very, very weak commodity prices, that which has stymied and reduced investment in production capacity in those countries. So what we're seeing in those countries is that despite the recovery in commodity prices, they're not in a position to benefit very quickly from the higher commodity prices. And so growth is remaining anemic because production cannot bounce back as quickly. The needed investment over the last 3-4 years has not taken place. So in these countries, I think there is a balancing act to be made. I mean, one, of course, is, you have all of these important industries that contribute so much to activity, so much to revenue, that you need to make sure are as efficient as possible and will contribute as commodity prices recover. So that's an important consideration. As importantly, however, of course, is the continuing need to diversify economies away from excessive reliance on these narrow commodities. So striking that balance will be really critical to making sure that you have resilient economy, to making sure that you have durable growth over the medium to long term.
Thank you, Abebe. So we have about 15 minutes left, and I know some of you are struggling to connect. So let's try Tamrat, and then Matthew Lee will come to you after Tamrat. Tamrat, go ahead.
Hi, Abu. How are you? Tamrat from Addis. Good to see you. Would you mind to comment on the debt restructuring that is going on with by many African countries with their creditors? And would you like to give a particular emphasis to Ethiopia, because there is a talk going on with Ethiopia's creditors, and I'm in particular interested to know whether or not Ethiopian authorities have submitted their financial plan to the financial committee co-chaired by China and France. And one last question. Can you explain why the IMF projecting GDP growth for 2022, which is quite unprecedented because I've been covering the IMF since the mid-1990s, and I've never seen IMF doing that. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. On debt restructurings in the region, across the region. So, what we have been seeing, of course, is, an increase in the number of countries that are facing debt pressures. Given the scale of the pandemic, the hit that it has, the hit to our country's economies. So, I think we saw countries like Zambia, which before the crisis was already in quite a bit of difficulty, being tipped over into a very clearly unsustainable debt position and requesting for debt restructuring. I think Chad is another case where, which has, of course, had to approach creditors for restructuring. Ethiopia also is in need of debt reprofiling and has, sought restructuring via the common framework. I think all three cases are at different stages of proceeding. Let me say a little bit about Zambia. I mean, Zambia is now, of course, we're discussing a new program with them, and we're hopeful that we can field a mission in the coming weeks where we can agree on the parameters of a program, and that will facilitate restructuring both with official and private creditors as soon as possible. This is a country that needs this official sector support and the involvement of the private sector as quickly as possible. In the case of Chad, the restructuring is really at a very frustrating point for the people of Chad. I have to say that, the official sector has provided the required assurances for us to proceed with disbursements. As we move forward, the World Bank and other official supporters of Chad would also be able to provide much needed financing. However, the private sector has not provided us the assurances that they will engage with restructuring with Chadian authorities in the coming weeks in good faith and consistent with Chad's capacity to repay. So we are waiting, we've been waiting really since the summer on Chad's private creditors to come up with this commitment. And the situation has got very serious. This is a country which is on the verge of a major food insecurity challenge. Rainfall, I understand from the minister, has been as low as the levels that were last seen in the mid-1980s, which, if you remember, was associated with a very difficult drought in much of the Sahel. So the situation in Chad is very serious, and we are very frustrated at not being able to move forward with the financial support that Chad requires on account of the country's private creditors not providing the much needed financing assurances. Coming to Ethiopia, I mean, Tamrat, you would know that I have to recuse myself on matters related to Ethiopia, so I'm going to ask Andrew to reach out to the team and they will provide answers. The team did, however, ask me to, anticipating questions on the GDP projections, asked me to convey that, the reason why we didn't show numbers for the medium term are on account of two factors. First, extremely high degree of uncertainty at the moment on economic prospects going forward. This is not unusual. Countries like Lebanon, we've done so. A second consideration is also the fact that the government has requested support for under a new program with the IMF, and those discussions have yet to begin. So those are the two factors that the reason for not showing the numbers. And again, this is not unprecedented, and we have countries like Argentina, Lebanon, for these two reasons where we have not shown growth projections. Thank you.
Thanks, Abi. And Tamrat, we'll come back to you on the additional Ethiopia question. Matthew, Lee, if we can come to you next, maybe focus on something that maybe Abe hasn't touched on already, a country that maybe, I understand you have one or two.
I hope so. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'll ask two questions then, and you can play it as you will. One, I wanted to know what the IMF thinks may be the economic implications of the International Court of Justice decision on the Somalia-Kenya maritime dispute. And secondarily, and I hope you'll answer this one, is I've asked the IMF a lot over the year about Cameroon. I know that they engaged with civil society about some COVID spending irregularities. I just wanted to know, I see the programs being announced, but has there been follow-up on the listing of beneficial owners, the conflict in the Anglophone areas, and those issues? Thanks for taking the question.
Absolutely. I mean, on Somalia-Kenya border dispute, really have nothing to add to that. But on Cameroon, I mean, I think one of the main things we've been trying to do over the years in programs, in engagement and discussion with country authorities in the region has been to increase transparency and public accounts as much as possible. Okay, it's not an easy undertaking. There are both technical and, of course, political reasons why this cannot happen as quickly as possible. But fast forward to the pandemic, and as we were dispersing much needed financial support when revenues were collapsing, spending needs were going through the roof, and countries did not have the financing space, the fiscal space to meet these pressing needs. We were dispersing relatively quickly, so we took even more steps to make sure that there were mechanisms in which transparency could be enhanced even more. Under regular programs, we can follow up through program reviews. But when we were dispersing rapidly upfront, we felt it was imperative that we had these additional measures. So last year, almost virtually all of our rapid financing endeavors, we have asked country authorities to, as Kristalina has been saying, spend the money but keep the receipts. And the purpose of this is basically, the money can go towards supporting your people, but there's also needs to be accountability. And among the steps that we've been asking countries to take is, first and foremost, audits to show where the money went. Second, to show that the companies that are contracting, that are making bids, we understand who the beneficial owners of these companies are. And these reports are now being prepared and being publicized. We are going to hold countries to live up to these commitments, and are following up diligently in all cases. There are delays, of course. Sometimes we will hold up program discussions, but if the delays are for legitimate reasons, either because it has not been possible to get auditors to do the audits as quickly as possible, then we will try and be pragmatic. So Cameroon, as elsewhere, we will follow up. And the aim of all of this work is to promote transparency, to show irregularities where there are irregularities, with the expectation that the accountability institutions internally will hold to account should they identify any misappropriation of resources. So what we are trying to do here is bring as much sunlight as possible to public finances, and we will expect, and hope that accountability institutions do their part where there are difficulties.
Thank you, Abe. We have a few minutes left, and I've got two questions, I think will be the last questions, Abe, that have come in via the press center, and one on WebEx from Claude in Benin, who's not able to connect visually. So we'll start with AFP. They're quick questions, Abe. It's Pierre Donadieu of AFP. He would like to know what the impact is of the growing insecurity in some parts of the continent, in the Sahel, in Nigeria, Mozambique, the eastern part of the DRC, and what that impact has on the outlook for these regions, for these countries. So that's the first one from AFP. And then the other one is from Claude. He would like to know what the options are, or what the progress has been made in terms of reallocation of SDRs from countries that have quite a bit to those that don't have a lot of it, and whether this reallocation is an immediate priority, I think, for us. So that's two questions.
Okay. Thanks. So on insecurity, rising violence in the region, it is of course really on top of all of the difficulties that the pandemic has wrought on our region. I mean, rising insecurity, as was cited in Mozambique, in the Sahel, in the Horn, is of course a source of grave concern, and it's something that beyond the toll it exacts on human lives and well-being, will also impact economic activity. It's something that we watch carefully and try and internalize in the projections that we do for economic activity, for the policy calibration of countries. But the one point I want to stress here is that the level of insecurity in the region is not as bad as what we used to see in the 80s or indeed much of the 90s. But we have seen a clear uptick, particularly in the Sahel over the last few years and more recently in Mozambique. And that's something that will require, of course, quite a bit of attention by politicians to facilitate a better economic policy-making environment. On SDR allocation, reallocation rather, this is of course very much something that we're focused on, really, as a whole, as an entire institution, and working on very, very aggressively. First, I think I should say that the SDR allocation, the largest ever that happened in August, really is very important sign of solidarity, global solidarity, because it's not something that comes about all that often, and the fact that it was as large as it was, I think, was fantastic. About 33 billion of this allocation will go to Africa. But clearly there's financing gaps the region faces are monumental, and there's a need to channel more resources to the region through the IMF, and the SDR is just one of the many vehicles that will be needed to support the region. In terms of rechanneling from those countries that have stronger balance of payments position towards more vulnerable countries, there are basically right now two concrete ways in which this we expect will happen. The first is through the provision of more resources, more SDRs to the PRGT, our Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. This has been used in the past by countries to rechannel SDRs to the IMF and through us to countries, and it allows us to offer zero interest rate loans with 10-year maturity to our members in the region. A second trust, a new one, is under consideration and was given very strong, encouraging endorsement by members of the IMF at our annual meetings. This is the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. This will provide resources for countries needing to undertake the major transformation that are going to be needed to tackle climate change, for example. And we're very hopeful that this trust can be up and running as soon as possible to allow us to provide financing with the support of, in terms of the design of the policies with the World Bank and others. This will provide even longer maturity financing, hopefully, to members. So that's another important vehicle that will allow for the rechanneling of SDRs. And beyond this, there are a number of other ideas about how to rechannel SDRs that we hope could come to fruition in the coming months. But I would say that this is very much the top of our to-do list for the institution in the coming weeks and months, and something that we're engaged in very, very actively.
Thank you, Abbe. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We've run out of time. Quite a few questions that we'll come back to bilaterally. And also, please look out for the documents. They are available on the website, the press release, the reports, some graphics that were presented here today. And also look out for the Western Hemisphere press conference that's taking place later on this morning. Thank you very much, and stay safe. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew.